In 2007, this unused key on your phone suddenly became the internet's most powerful punctuation mark. It's now used 3 billion times a day to organize content and track conversations. Meet the hashtag and the Carnegie Mellon University graduate who invented it and gave it away for free. Hello, you're listening to Where What If Becomes What's Next from Carnegie Mellon University, where we ask the bold questions that become innovations for the betterment of humanity. As CMU celebrates its 125th anniversary, we're spotlighting 15 CMU inventions that not only changed technology, they changed the world. In today's episode, we're telling the story of the invention of the hashtag, which fundamentally shaped how we experience and use social media. But this isn't the first time that the right people at CMU asked the right question at the right time to redefine the limits of what's possible. For example, in the late 1950s, professors Herbert Simon and Alan Newell created what is considered the first artificial intelligence program. In 1982, computer scientist Scott Fahlman invented the emoticon when he used a smiley face symbol to distinguish jokes from serious posts on an online message board. In 1992, researcher Nathaniel Borenstein invented the MIME attachment protocol, which for the first time enabled users to send multimedia files by email. And in the early 2000s, Professor Louise von Ahn invented the CAPTCHA and later the reCAPTCHA to distinguish real human users from automated internet bots. But now, let's welcome Chris Messina onto our show. Chris graduated from CMU's School of Design in 2003 and became a Silicon Valley technologist, product designer, venture capital investor, and most famously, the inventor of the hashtag. Chris, let's go back to 2007. You had just graduated from CMU a few years earlier. Walk us through the birth of the hashtag. How did this idea come to you?
I'll go sufficiently far back so you understand the evolution of this. After I graduated with a CFA degree, I went out to San Francisco, basically because I was very excited about the web. And the first thing that I started working on was the launch of the Firefox browser. And I'd gotten involved with the open source ecosystem. And so after the launch of Firefox, I started to organize this event called Barcamp. Barcamp was an open-ended, open source event that anybody could come to and talk about what they were doing and what they were building on this new web platform. And the first event that we organized was in 2005. And after we got together, we wanted to stay in touch and keep meeting up. And Twitter had come out as a text-only or SMS-based platform for essentially sending a message from your phone to a centralized service that then would send the message out to all of your friends. That was incredibly hard to do back then. And it also allowed for people to opt in to follow anybody else who they might be interested in. The idea and the inspiration for the hashtag came from going to South by Southwest in March of 2007, 3 months after the iPhone had come out, and basically struggling to use Twitter to keep our friends updated on where the parties and events were down in Austin. And so I'd been very active in IRC and other sort of nerd centers, back then with the launch of Firefox. And I was like, what if we had kind of IRC channels, but in Twitter?
IRC stands for Internet Relay Chat and was an early form of text-based real-time messaging on computer bulletin boards, networks, and forums. IRC discussions were organized around channels marked by a hashtag. How would that work on Twitter?
We only have 140 characters, but if we can smush the words together and, put some symbol in front of the sequence of characters, then maybe Twitter could actually use that information to allow people to subscribe to get notified if anybody posted using effectively what was a tag. And so that was the inspiration. And that's why the very first hashtag was about Barcamp, was this event that my friends were going to. I tweeted about the idea in August of 2007. And then I wrote up kind of a long blog post that mocked up how I thought this idea could actually be implemented as a designer on the Twitter service. And I ended up walking down the street in South Park, San Francisco, because that's where I lived, and Twitter's headquarters were there. I walked in through the front door. There was no security. And went up to Biz Stone, one of the co-founders, and kind of proposed my idea. I was like, hey, I think I've solved this group problem, this coordination problem on Twitter. And he kind of just dismissed the idea out of hand. This idea is for nerds. This is never going to work. And so I kind of took that as an invocation to go continuing to try to promote this idea.
As a designer choosing a symbol to organize these group conversations, why the pound sign? Why not an asterisk or something else?
It's also important to remember the hardware that we used back then. And so many of us had these feature phones or flip phones or even like Blackberries, because the multi-touch interface hadn't yet been really widely adopted. And so back then you had like a numeric keypad, and that keypad had a bunch of numbers, and then below the numbers had all the letters of the alphabet. And so you'd tap your message to send your tweet using that keypad. And so there were two unused characters at the bottom of the keypad. One was the asterisk and one was the pound symbol. And because the pound symbol wasn't being used for anything, it was like, oh, that's amazing. And then it just so happened that that same symbol was being used in IRC for channels. And so, I found that as a designer and a non-engineer, I oftentimes have to find the least taxing way to get people to do things for me. I've got to somehow make this so simple for them that they barely have to do any work. And so because this white space was available for this keypad, that seems like the best thing to use. We're already using IRC. I don't have to convince anybody of anything else.
I get it, but not many people used the hashtag on Twitter when you first proposed it. So when did the hashtag start to catch on?
Later that fall, when a friend of mine, Nate Ritter, was down in San Diego, and he was essentially one of the first citizen journalists using social media to share information to his community about this wildfire that was raging. And so he was at home listening to the police radio and the fire radio, and essentially taking this information and then propagating it to Twitter. And because at the time, our 3G networks were not reliable. They would go down constantly, and especially in fires and disasters, they would also go down. But the SMS network was more resilient and stayed up. And so he was using Twitter essentially to get information out to his friends and family and his community using Twitter because it was over SMS. And so people could track San Diego fire as a phrase with the pound symbol in front of it, and they would receive all information that was related to the fire. What was important about this was that anybody who had information about those fires could then also contribute to that collective knowledge by simply putting a pound symbol in front of San Diego fire. If you were tracking like San space Diego space fire, you wouldn't get updates about that because those are three different words. But if you switch them together, that becomes a new form, and you can actually follow that in Twitter. So that's how that kind of had value in the early days.
And that's when the hashtag caught fire, pardon the pun. It wasn't just a fun thing. It was saving lives with real-time information in a crisis. And so what happened next?
In October 2007, a friend of mine, Mike Calore, who'd been to the Barcamp events, who was a writer at Wired, first wrote up the story of the hashtag. And so that was very valuable and important for us to do two things. One was to demonstrate that social media had a value beyond just sharing what we were having for breakfast, which is what a lot of people thought at the time. And second, this was also a way to propagate the use of this new symbol where there was some cultural purpose.
Nearly 20 years later, the hashtag is everywhere, with estimates of 3 to 4 billion uses per day across all social platforms. How did Twitter ultimately go from rejecting the idea to fully embracing it?
Quite adversarially, I suppose. For quite some time, they really resisted the hashtag because, and reasonably, they thought it was ugly. They thought they could do it better with a different solution. I was solving for a somewhat different problem space than what they were solving for. And aesthetics, while important, weren't the critical part about the communication that I was trying to enable. Twitter resisted for a long time, but then they started to acquire companies that had built on the Twitter API and had actually added support independently for the hashtag. And so rather than rip out that code that supported it, they just left it in. The hashtag was like a Trojan horse into Twitter. It became part of the service, not because Twitter wanted it to, but because they couldn't resist it. And then when Instagram launched, that was when things really shifted. Instagram needed a way to index all of the content in order to enable search. So it turned out that Instagram actually ended up using the hashtag for indexing all of their photos. And then eventually Instagram was acquired by, Facebook and then Meta. And as an advertising play, suddenly I think Twitter realized that they had been sitting on a gold mine because they could run ads against these hashtags. And so at that point, Twitter actually tried to trademark the hashtag. That's when I had to sort of introduce myself as the person who had come up with this idea and that it wasn't going to be for them.
As the creator, you wanted the hashtag to run without anyone owning or controlling it, neither you nor Twitter. So when was that moment you realized that your creation had a life of its own and could change the world?
I think the first time that I realized that the hashtag might sort of escape the lab, so to speak, was when I was driving in somewhere like rural California, and I actually saw like a billboard on the side of the road for the hashtag Tea Party. And once I saw that the hashtag was now being used for politics, that really blew my mind, because back then, prior to Obama, getting into office, the tech world and politics really were completely different ecosystems. And so the fact that this upstart organization that was, grassroots and decentralized was using social media, and not just using social media, but using the hashtag, that to me showed me that these cultures were starting to fuse and to come together. And of course, we live in that world now, but that was the first inklings of it.
The hashtag didn't just organize information. It became an engine for social change. Me Too, Black Lives Matter, the Arab Spring. These movements used it to reshape the world. How did a tool you designed for sorting tweets about parties at South by Southwest end up doing that?
You can't separate the success and impact of the hashtag from social media. If people didn't adopt social media, it wouldn't have happened. If the iPhone had come out 2 years earlier, or if I'd been 2 years later in my proposal, perhaps the hashtag wouldn't have never taken off. However, one, it addressed such a core need of human communication. And, given my experience as a communication designer at CMU and like learning about communication, learning about typography, learning about design, learning about messaging, all of these things were sort of in the back of my mind as I was imagining, how are people really going to benefit from and take advantage of this new ecosystem that we're creating? And so the fact that the hashtag could be useful for stupid things or for hobbies or interests, sports, also meant that it could be useful for very impactful and cultural things and conversations that previously had been subterranean or had been below the radar or too distributed to really rise to the level where the news media would know how to cover it. It also created something that was new in media where anybody could join and then participate in the conversation. They didn't have to get permission from a gatekeeper. It used to be the case that you'd write sort of an op-ed, into the newspaper, and that's how you got your voice out there. Now you can just open up your phone and post something and add a hashtag, and now you're joining a bigger conversation. And so this let people start to really see themselves in the media in a way that I think the former formats had not. And so a lot of these underground conversations that really were easy to sweep under the rug, especially by powerful people, suddenly became immutable.
The hashtag not only changed social media, it changed the way we speak. People use it like air quotes for emphasis when speaking. Saturday Night Live did a famous skit about people talking in hashtags. It's now in the Scrabble, Oxford English, and the Merriam-Webster dictionaries. You essentially invented a new cultural punctuation mark, kind of like the $sign, right?
I don't know who invented like the $sign or who first decided to like separate numbers by putting the $sign in front of it. Like one is much more desirable than, a number that doesn't have that in front of it. And so in a similar way, that allows people to be clearer in the way that they're communicating and expressing. And so the hashtag started to represent a culture that was an internet culture that was not part of the mainstream, but very quickly was becoming a force and a dominant force in shaping the ideas and the ways that we express ourselves. And so the hashtag sort of was a bridge, I think, both in the verbal world as well as this online digital space.
At the hashtag's peak, people were stuffing 20 or 30 hashtags into a single post, the exact opposite of the elegant, focused tool you designed. Did you feel like a proud parent watching your creation grow, or more like Dr. Frankenstein watching a monster take over?
Every parent at some point kind of like is like, wow, I have, both a teenager and a monster. And sometimes they're delightful and joyful. And other times, man, you just want to like, I think the thing that's also challenging about the hashtag is what it reveals about both like human psychology, incentive structures, the motivations for creating content. The behavior that you're describing, on the one hand, may be discussed in a positive way where people are just trying to find audience. And so they're not quite sure which hashtags they're going to use. And so they actually add a bunch of very relevant tags. In other cases, and more nefarious cases, you have people that are essentially coming into the social media space. They don't respect the space. They're looking to exploit the attention economy, and they will use whatever the most popular tags are, because at the time, before algorithms, it was a rather naive way to sort content. And the crazy thing about it is like, we now are in a world where algorithms largely determine the content that we see, and those algorithms are a direct response to the ways in which humans exploited and misused the hashtag and other social media. So as upset as people are about that, it's like you brought this on yourselves. If you'd respected the space and treated it well, which, is a ridiculous thing for me to ask for, maybe people would actually feel much better about social media.
This seems like a good place to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk more with Chris Messina on the birth of the hashtag and its impacts on society.
From its founding during the Second Industrial Revolution to breakthroughs that helped define artificial intelligence and the digital age, Carnegie Mellon University has helped shape the modern world. Behind every discovery is a story, and those stories live in the university archives. Home to CMU history, the archives preserves hundreds of thousands of records that document more than a century of innovation, creativity, and impact. From the papers of Herb Simon, Alan Newell, and Manuela Veloso, to the records of the Robotics Institute and the School of Drama, to oral histories and community collections, the archives preserves the ideas and the voices that connect the past to the ideas shaping tomorrow. Explore these stories through our digital collections or plan a visit to the archives in Hunt Library. Begin your research and discover when what if becomes what's possible.
Welcome back. You're listening to Where What If Becomes What's Next from Carnegie Mellon University. We're talking with Chris Messina, who invented the hashtag back in 2007 and has seen it used billions of times every day for organizing content on the internet. So Chris, it's time to dig a little deeper into the DNA of hashtags. So what makes a hashtag powerful?
I think what's so interesting is hashtags are a type of social media poetry because they break forms. And it's a different type of expression. If you know what a hashtag means, then you can participate. Making a good hashtag is about capturing a cultural zeitgeist. Sometimes people can be using hashtags for some period of time, and it almost has a snowball effect. Hashtag Me Too or Black Lives Matter were tags that were used for some time before certain celebrities or certain influencers amplified or picked up those messages. And then it was almost like a lightning bolt that caused the participation, almost like an invitation to get a bunch of people to come and join that conversation. But you have to have designed it in a way, or the phrase or tag itself has to be in such a way that it invites participation. You can have hashtags that are negatively about one thing, but that creates something that can easily be exploited by one side or the other to make certain statements. Whereas if you have something that's a little more open-ended and invites dialogue and participation, then those tags can actually persist for some time.
All right, let's flash back to the beginning. You're in high school. What drew you to Carnegie Mellon, and what was it about the intersection of design and technology that hooked you?
To be quite honest, I'd had a pretty negative experience at the end of my high school experience. I had built out my high school's website, and I also built out a number of my high school's student club websites. And one of those websites was for Gay Straight Alliance. I put a banner ad for a number of school clubs on the high school site, and one of them was an ad for the Gay Straight Alliance. And my principal discovered this, and he suspended me for 6 days. And I didn't think I was going to graduate, and I kind of was fed up with the whole institutional schooling system. So I was very uninterested actually in college. I was just going to go build on the web and kind of do the dropout thing. But fortunately, I had an English teacher in high school that really encouraged me. And so I looked at a bunch of different design schools because I was really interested in design. Design was the nexus of art and the web. And so I chose a focus of design. And CMU was one of the better schools for that. It also had a great CS program. And it was small enough and somewhat close enough to the East Coast that I didn't have to fly all the way across the country to go to Stanford. So I think people there are really interested in ideas, but also about the practical application of these things. And so it's not just going off to your ivory castle or school and spending years toiling away at things that never actually make it into people's hands or the world, but is actually quite grounded in practical application and practice. Because if I'd just gone off and done a PhD on communication, none of this stuff would have ever actually been used by anybody. And I would have missed the whole window, which was the opportunity for me to affect social media.
There does seem to be something in the water at CMU when it comes to computer inventions. The smiley face emoticon, artificial intelligence, the first Wi-Fi network, the MIME attachment for email. What is it about the place that keeps producing these kinds of inventions?
I think it's a mix, like I said, of exploration, research, and then application. You can have a bunch of patents sitting on your wall, and if no one ever uses your thing, congratulations, good for you.
You never made a dime off the hashtag by choice. In fact, you deliberately didn't patent it. Tell me about that.
Not this is like a therapy session, but it turned out that I had a kind of like deep unaddressed money wound that was the result of my parents getting divorced. And the reason that at least I interpreted that they got divorced was because my dad didn't want to pay for me to go to some private high school. And that was really disappointing to my mom. And then she divorced him. Now, the message that I took away from that experience as a sensitive but very like highly verbal person was that money is the root of all disconnection and therefore I should avoid it. And so I did for most of my career. And that's why I got into open source. I thought open source was a pure expression of contributing the things that I really thought were powerful and important and useful, but I would not be corrupted by taking money in exchange to motivate me to do things. And so I kind of have my career life and like how I made an income, and I was like consulting and doing things for other people. And then there was the things that I wanted to do, which was working in open standards and open source and the hashtag. And so when it came to the hashtag, the reason why I didn't want to patent it or add any kind of intellectual property protections against it, half naively, but also half in principle, was because I didn't want to be the gatekeeper for people using this idea. I didn't want to be the person that decided, yes, you can use it, but you can't use it. Oh, you want to use it? You have to pay me a certain amount of money. The idea was for this to be a tool for cultural propagation and creation. And if you had to get permission to use it, that would actually stifle the adoption of it. And so that's why I was very intentional about actually not going down the path of intellectual property protections, because it didn't serve my ultimate purpose.
So now let's talk about what's next. AI is fundamentally changing how we discover and organize content. It can see images, hear audio, watch video. It doesn't need a hashtag to find and surface relevant content. So where does the hashtag fit in an AI-driven world? And what does this mean for the future of search and social media?
I don't know if it's still the case, but certainly over the last couple of years, if you would go to ChatGPT and ask it to like write a tweet for you or a LinkedIn post, almost all of them would have some number of hashtags at the bottom. So just because we're moving into a world of like chatbots that supposedly have linguistic mastery doesn't mean that all the data that they've been trained on isn't rife with hashtags. So in that sense, you're probably not going to get rid of it that easily. I actually use a lot of hashtags personally in my own documents, my own private documents. I use these as a way to tag and label the things that I'm working on across different applications. The fact that you can write a hashtag anywhere where you can write text means that it's durable and it's robust. It's very hard to remove it because you don't actually know what the user's intent is. They might be using it again just for their own purposes, not because they're trying to join some global conversation. Whether the younger generation grows up knowing what they are or thinks that they're cringe, I don't know. These things do have a sort of fashionable element. I'm going to say this and this will probably come true, but is the hashtag like the bell bottoms of social media? I mean, maybe, but young kids are wearing like these bloomers again. It's just like this stuff comes in waves. And we're still using the dollar sign in front of numbers, and now we've got even more symbols. So, will there be more? Will there be different ones? Perhaps. I mean, that is the ultimate plasticity of language, because our minds and our thoughts are constantly changing and evolving, and we need new forms and structures to express them more clearly.
If hashtags are the bell bottoms of social media, what's the next thing? Are you dreaming up the next symbol that could shape how we communicate online?
I get this question in different ways quite a lot. Some people are like, well, I want to go create the next hashtag. And I'm like, good on you. Go have fun. Whatever is necessary to help people communicate clearly in the future is going to be very based on a set of kind of commingled efficiencies. One is about human expression. Another is about clarity. Another is about like the attention availability and space. And also like what are people trying to say or do? So the quest to make meaning and to share that meaning with other humans, I think remains an unsolved problem. And I think that means that whether it's the hashtag or something else, people are going to try to find ways to come together around content, around media, around experiences, around understanding what life is about.
What is the one thing that you want people to know about the invention of the hashtag?
The lesson of the hashtag, for me, is that it represents that individuals can actually have quite a bit of influence on the technology that we use, and that becomes ubiquitous. And if you start from a place of pure principles and wanting to do well, and you kind of bake that into the way in which someone uses or participates with or benefits from your inventions or your creations or your solutions, that can ultimately have a ripple effect. And so I suppose what was implicit in that last answer was the sense that there is some sovereignty that still exists for people to choose the types of technologies that they use, and that I'm an example of that. I decided not to listen to Twitter and to go ahead and put my idea out there. And then I helped to propagate it and get people to adopt it. And then it became ubiquitous. And it still is part of the culture 15, 16, 17 years later. And it's used in all sorts of places that I have never seen and I will never know. But the benefits to those people make sense in their contexts. And none of them had to come back to get permission from me, nor do they have to check in with me. And they can just use this idea in whatever way makes sense to them. And so I hope that we hold on to that, even as we become more awash in agents and robots that do all these things for us. These are all choices that we can make.
All right, I've got to ask it. It's the last impossible question. Out of the billions of hashtags that exist, do you have a favorite?
I have two answers for this. It's sort of like your first child. I think hashtag Barcamp is a pure expression of me doing this for me and for my community and for nothing else. Barcamp is a pretty nerdy, geeky event, and that's where it came from. So people need to know, even if they're on SNL or they're Snoop Dogg and they're using the hashtag, like, you're using a nerd's tool, frankly. The other, is that my favorite hashtag is the hashtag that's about to be used, but that hasn't been used yet. And so that's sort of my interest in driving into the future and making sure that this thing persists and people understand why it's there and how it got there.
Well, that concludes our episode. Thank you to our guest, Chris Messina, and thanks to you for listening. And if you want to learn more about CMU's 125th anniversary and its innovations, you can search, of course, by using hashtag CMU125. Please check the show notes where you'll find links to additional resources for this episode. And to learn more or contact us with a story, idea, or comments, please visit cmu.edu/whatsnextpodcast. If you're enjoying this show, please rate and review us on your favorite podcast site and share with friends. And be sure to subscribe so you'll never miss an episode. I'm Randy Scott, and you've been listening to Where What If Becomes What's Next from Carnegie Mellon University, where we are asking the bold questions that become innovations for the betterment of humanity. Stay tuned and stay curious.